Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And I feel like I've covered a little bit less country in 2022 than I would like. And I think it's about time we fix that. Another all-country episode in this series. Let's get on the pulse. So before we go any further, if you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be extremely grateful. These sort of mono-genre episodes, especially country, which are kind of niche, don't get a lot of traffic. Hope we see some more of that. But now we got 6 albums on the docket. Let's first go back and talk about from the Cactus Blossoms, One Day.
Do you wanna take a trip with me? Got a feeling there might be a silver lining all around.
I'm not sure whether to say that this Minneapolis duo was on my radar thanks to the indie country scene throwing a solid amount of acclaim in their direction, or finding their newest project thanks to a random dive on Bandcamp. But with a jaunt through their catalog, they're actually surprisingly easy to describe. Imagine classic Everly Brothers harmonies with a smattering of soft-focused 70s country touches, maybe a little bit sleepy even when they added a bit more grit to their 2019 album, and the writing might be able to use a bit more meat, but hell, when the warm textures and the harmonies are this charming, it's kind of hard to care that much. Anyway, this is their newest project from about a month or so back, and I'd probably say it's closest to their 2016 album You're Dreaming than their last. The electric textures are more burnished, nestled in among the acoustics. The production as a whole feels more rounded and gentle, courtesy of a more developed bass presence and kind of playful percussion, but no less warm and inviting in its stripped-back 70s mid-tempo textures, full of touches of pedal steel and harmonies that are just rich as ever. Honestly, it's such a brisk, comforting listen that it might take you a couple of times before you start wondering what really stands out across this project, outside of Jenny Lewis stepping in to provide some very delicate vocals on Everybody. But that's kind of the trick with this album. There's not much in the way of a dramatic standout amidst the very uniform quality, provided you've got an ear for this sort of retro pastiche. Just the subtle moments that might catch you a little off guard, but have an almost hypnotic quality. The hushed 60s-esque harmonies bouncing off the sharp lead on Hey Baby, the gentle AM rock popping of Is It Over and Lonely Heart, especially with the latter having its playful pedal steel and guitar interplay, the chirpy lead that bounces off the surf rock guitar timbre on Runaway, or the shuffling minor key echo of Ballad of an Unknown. Now granted, if the lyrics had a little bit more distinctive flair, couldn't hurt, it certainly would help. They're rarely bad outside of the title track being a kiss-off that the Cactus Blossoms can't really sell, and Ballad of an Unknown doing a snapshot of the homeless that unfortunately does very little that's all that special, but a lot of what we got are pretty mature songs of love and loss and remembrance that in a different time could have easily become standards for how plain-spoken and effective that they are. But that's also kind of the thing. The Cactus Blossoms are very much in the shadow of those standards and those influences. Not a bad thing, because again, they're really good at this, and this is a really solid album, but if there's a band that needs to take a little bit more of a creative leap, it might be this one. So yeah, pretty good project, not quite great though. Next up from Shook The Disarmers, Nightroamer.
Last time, I ain't just keeping you around as a pastime. Swear I won't take you for granted, yet I don't deserve the man. Baby, please give me one last try.
And speaking of acts I should have been covering years ago, Shook The Disarmers have been on my radar since Sidelong got the Bloodshot re-release in 2017, playing to a rougher brand of country that tilted into indie rock and even some punk rock, reminding me a lot of Lydia Loveless, but with a slightly more old-school country bent in the compositions. And given how damn solid Years was back in 2018, I was really excited to see what a long absence might do for Shook and their band. And full disclosure, I really wanted to like this a lot more than I do. It's an odd situation because I'm not really sure what changed that much since Years outside of some little details that just aren't coalescing. Their vocals are a little bit deeper in the mix, which doesn't really help the hooks pop off in the same way, especially with a slightly rougher fidelity recording, which strangely feels a little less inflected with raw edges alongside the pedal steel. I've heard some folks call this way more of an indie rock or adult alternative release, and while you might hear it a little with some of the 90s and 2000s progressions and the lead guitar melodies on a couple of songs, overall it's just not that accurate. This is still very much country. Instead, especially with the acoustics and the drums, it feels like the highs are mixed particularly sharp, which doesn't exactly help the low-end grooves pop as much as they could either. And then there's the writing, where I'm not gonna say that it's bad. Sarah Shook has an eye for nuanced framing and a very level-headed approach to their relationship drama and a lonely struggle against one's vices, where they'll take the blame as often as they'll throw it back, but ultimately strive to keep on trudging forward. But let's be real, it's not all that surprising or boundary pushing for them. A lot of songs here could have easily shown up on either of the last two albums, and without a little bit more distinctive detail or nuance in the compositions, this album can run together really fast. Now, that's not saying it isn't a good vibe, because again, Sarah Shook has a real swagger and texture they pull off really well, but without much in the way of standout tracks, it's kinda hard to recommend outside of that very specific, comfortable niche. Certainly a solid, very enjoyable album. Not sure it's a great one though. Just saying. Next up from Jenny Tolman, Married in a Honky Tonk.
Singing along, and that's how I got married in a honky tonk.
Now this was a nice surprise. For those of you who don't know, Jenny Tolman's name has been coming up in the underground the past couple of years as potentially being the next coming of country Casey Musgraves. And going into her 2019 album, There Goes the Neighborhood, it really is an apt comparison, thanks to the quirky balance of humorous and heartfelt, textured neo-traditional instrumentation, and a lot of genuine wit that's all the way through. Her voice might not be as distinctive, probably runs a little bit closer to Angelina Presley or Carly Pearce, but the playfulness balanced out with some more adult leanings. Okay, let me just say it, it's a lot hornier. It wound up endlessly charming for me, and I was really excited to hear this new album. And yeah, it's really pretty great. And there has been an absolute progression since There Goes the Neighborhood, not just in how she uses the intro to set the scene of the album in the same small town universe that might be more encompassing than some might actually realize, even as she's grown a little bit older and wiser since getting married in the meantime. If anything, this album feels more like a slightly broader, flashier expansion of what we previously got with that vintage neo-traditional charm with the pedal steel and fiddle, now augmented with some more soulful touches on Sweetest Revenge and Watering the Weeds. Seriously, her usage of backing vocals is legit superb, and even some horns on Working Woman's Blues, where Jenny Tolman takes her rather sardonic observations to a slightly wider angle lens. And it's not just in the excellently balanced, heartfelt songs of love and romance, like the gorgeous Afraid, the very spacious Same Train as You with that fiddle line, and the heartbreaking closer Nothing Left of You, but also needling into online gossip culture and social media on World's a Small Town, and even workaday capitalism on Watering the Weeds and Working Woman's Blues. I'm not sure I've heard many lines as cutting in country as "we spend our lives working long hard hours to buy the things to impress the people that we don't like." But that's the thing, this is not an album that's trying to be revolutionary. It just steps into some rather charged territory with a wink and a smile that leaves you a little bit shocked at the clever revelations that she just breezes through. She makes it look easy. One of my favorites is I Know Some Cowboys. This is a coy shot at her partner to put some work into actually satisfying her, or she'll go down to Texas and find some cowboys who will. I mean, it's kind of ballsy to be this blunt about it, but again, she makes it look easy. Now that being said, some of the broader comedy doesn't always work. The title track feels like a little bit of a retread of Carrie Underwood's Last Name, and Home to Roost pushes its running metaphor to a bit of a corny extreme. And at least for me, there is a part of me that does kind of miss the slightly rougher textures and subtler edges on There Goes the Neighborhood. But come on, this album's legit great. One of the strongest country albums I've heard thus far in 2022. Absolutely worth a lot more attention. You probably missed this album this year. You should fix it. Check that out. Next up from Hailey Whitters, Raised.
Friday nights and they taught me to drink and they taught me to fight. When I think about all of the men that I've known, there ain't none like the boys back home.
So when I first covered Hailey Whitters in 2020, I remember hearing an artist that I mostly liked in terms of her co-writers and backing team, but where the approach to her own sound, from the production to the vocal delivery, still needed a little refinement. So hearing about something closer to a concept album coming from her with Raise did have my curiosity and attention. And you know, I kinda get why this is getting a lot more ears this time around, because the first big pivot is immediately obvious and it's a major upgrade: the instrumentation and production. I mean, call me a sucker for a solid neo-traditional pivot, I totally am, but the wells of pedal steel off the warm acoustics, the firm bass, and the welcome fiddles, they immediately give Whitters' sharper, Natalie Maines-esque vocals a much better foundation, and there's less of the clunky gimmicks that can occasionally pull me out of her last album. Hell, replacing them with BJ Barham of American Aquarium on Middle of America, it kinda feels like stacking the deck in her favor. That song's great. And while there are tracks that will take some rougher detours, the smoky Plain Jane and the neon with the subtle gallop, the hand claps that are punctuating Everything She Ain't, the soulful touches behind Boys Back Home, on average they just feel more organic and better balanced in the mix, a major net positive. And what's also worth highlighting is that there are fewer name co-writers this time in general, only one from Brandy Clark and two from Laurie McKenna, and that kinda makes sense for Hailey Whitters' back and forth relationship with her own hometown where she was born and raised. It's more personal, which as she's gotten a little bit older finds a deeper pull tugging her back from more rebellious years, probably best showcased on Beer Tastes Better. And you know what? On the one hand, that deeper sense of lived-in wisdom adds some balance to the rougher edges on Big Family and Middle of America, or the storytelling of College Town that highlights exactly how kids might change a little when they go away for school, and doesn't shy away from any tension that might happen when they come back to the family, or the ode to sensitive guys on Pretty Boys, serving as an interesting balance to Boys Back Home, which shows the moments where there might be a bit of a wistful yearning for guys who actually stayed behind and kept or developed some real character. Now on the flip side, some of that old petty streak does slip into Everything She Ain't, and I did find some of the rural, small-town fondness definitely tipped into more straightforward hagiography that you hear all over the most forgettable parts of mainstream country for the past 2 decades, which didn't so much feel like pulling punches as reflecting a more conservative bent that didn't quite go as deep or as textured as it could. And maybe it's just as a Canadian where it has been legalized, but I found Our Grass Is Legal to be so goddamn corny in the worst way. I mean, come on. But I think my larger point of frustration is that for as much as I get a lot of good texture and framing from Hailey Whitters' small town stories, I feel like there is another step that needs to be taken, either with a little bit more unique lyrical details, as there's a few songs that lapse towards cliche and obvious plays for the mainstream, or a little bit more depth to help differentiate her from her influences, which do kind of loom over this. As it is though, absolute improvement across the board. That makes for a really goddamn good album, just lacking that added flair, edge, or depth to find true greatness. Still very good listen though, so it's worth hearing. Check it out. Next up from Shooter Jennings and Yelawolf, Sometimes Why.
She'll be heartbroken by the sunlight and give it all to the rock and roll, baby.
Alright, full disclosure, I've been kinda tired of Yelawolf for the past couple of years. He's got his niche and his sound and a couple songs I really respect, but some of the nasty rumors swirling around his ugly exit from Shady, combined with some wildly inconsistent production and some highly questionable collabs, kinda kept me at an arm's length. He did an entire project with Riff Raff in 2021, for God's sake. But this was a collab that did attract some interest. A country rock project produced entirely by Shooter Jennings, son of Waylon Jennings, and while critical reception's been, let's be polite and say, very mixed, I'd figured I'd give it a shot. At the very least, it could be the funny kind of disaster. Well, here's the thing. It is a complete mess, in a way that these sorts of genre fusions often are, smearing together 80s hard rock and power pop, radio in particular damn near reminds me of Bon Jovi, southern rock, smattering of country, and let's not forget some increasingly awkward southern rap touches, overflowing with glossy synths from Shooter Jennings himself. I mean, it's the sort of weirdness that often comes with these sorts of genre fusions, where it kinda sits in an uncanny valley that you might wind up liking or getting a taste for if the composition compositions hold up, but it's not quite weird enough to push boundaries, and leaves you thinking that a more focused approach might be more effective. Or you just get the songs like Fucked Up Day with the live trap skitters and Moonshine's Run with the seedy Volbeat imitation that can't remotely sell its heaviness effectively, but they're both weirdly clunky and melancholic to end the project, especially for as abrupt as this ending is. And you know, if you're here for Yelawolf as more of a rapper than a singer, you're gonna end up disappointed. He still has a few flows, but he's never had as much vocal power as he thinks he does, and his very nasal delivery is not for everyone. No, that's been true for years now. And in the usual problem I've had with some of Yelawolf's writing, if he doesn't get into more storytelling or more raw emotional territory, a lot of his backwoods-inflected sleaze on the outskirts of any American dream can feel more two-dimensional texture than insight, a lot of grimy rock and roll iconography and posturing, where you're hoping there might be a little bit more nuance or cutting focus. And you know, while the whole experience can work if you buy in, the melting pot of genres makes pulling more coherent messages kind of an exercise in futility. But yet, the secret weapon Yelawolf has always had is a knack for melodic composition, and with Shooter Jennings helping to refine the details, there are just some shockingly great hooks on this album. The jangling Hold My Head with the blast of organ off the guitars, the bassy smolder and roiling sizzle of Rock and Roll Baby with those terrific sounding drums. Overall, the production on this album is shockingly good. The pedal steel bleeding across the smoky spoken word and acoustics of Shoestring, and Jump Out the Window, it's his stab at 80s Springsteen John Mellencamp, and again, it's way better than it has any right to be. Jack Antonoff, you might have some competition with just as limited of a singer. Alright, now look. A lot of folks will find this messy stylism a little bit too much to stomach, just in bad taste. That's been an issue with Yelawolf since Love Story back in 2015, even if I might disagree. But when a lot of the production is consistently solid, and there's enough compositions that can pull in the flurry of bourbon-smoked ramshackle Americana imagery together, there's enough great moments that really grew on me. I'll wind up endorsing this. It's a weird listen, but it's a pretty good one. Give it a shot. Check it out. And finally, from ERNEST, Flower Shops, the album.
If you cut off the thorn, she can't take no more.
Let me make this abundantly clear. ERNEST had an uphill battle to win me over. I mean, he started off in country rap, for God's sakes, and wound up co-writing for a lot of the bro country scene as that subgenre wound down. But going back to his 2019 project, it gave me more the impression he was a bit of a chameleon as a performer and artist. And while he does have a somewhat unique lyrical cadence and flow, he didn't quite have a sound or a distinctive identity as a writer, which might be why he was able to slip towards neo-traditional country so effectively with Flower Shops. Yeah, it kinda sucks that Morgan Wallen wound up as the anchor point to push it to the mainstream attention, given that all he has here is a performance credit, but okay. The full album's out now. What did ERNEST deliver? Well, that vaguely anonymous feel does translate to the album as well. Yeah, the supple pedal steel and the strings embellishments play up an old school, borderline 70s countrypolitan timbre to a lot of these textures, which on some level will be an easy sell for a lot of folks. Seriously, the production is warm, lush, incredibly well balanced, just genuinely great across the board. But dig a little bit deeper and what anchors that sound? I've heard ERNEST compared to Hardy a couple of times as a writer who has some flavor, we'll come back to that, but he can't really sell it as a unique vocal personality, and while I think ERNEST has better taste as a whole and doesn't default to list-driven cliches as often, it's not surprising that he spent more time behind the scenes than in front of the mic. He doesn't have that much character, so you would expect the writing to be what puts ERNEST on a different level, and yet I'm not sure it does. The problem is that outside of Flower Shops, there's just not much in the way of detail or nuance that gives ERNEST a lot of distinctive personality beyond the current crop of bro or boyfriend country writers. He tends to default to more settled-in love songs like Tennessee Queen, but he's also a bit of a free-roaming, hard-drinking screw-up on the songs like Feet Wanna Run, and especially Comfortable When I'm Crazy, but not to the point where there's anything close to real danger or intrigue, mostly because there's always this surreptitious vicious dodge of responsibility, mostly by pointing the finger at the girls who are pushing him to it. This is not all that unique in mainstream country. But the weird thing is that when we get to the post-relationship songs on the back half of the album, like Did It With You, What It Comes To, and Some Other Bar, the production weirdly loses a lot of its atmosphere and gets way closer to the overly polished mainstream cuts that are basically interchangeable on Music Row. And that kind of compromises the initial illusion that there might be something more here. And no, that doesn't make it bad by any means. It is a decent introduction to this guy, or at the very least his producers, but it's not an album that feels overflowing with potential. There might be a low ceiling, and I'm not sure how long it's gonna stick. That's all. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be extremely grateful. This is going to be a bit of an odd episode. Again, the all one genre episodes are a bit of a thing that I don't mind doing, but again, it takes a lot to build up to them, and again, I'm a little late to some of these. But hey, if you have comments about all of them, I hope you do. Please leave them down there below. Please share the video if possible here, because again, we're trying to actually drive some traction to the mono-genre videos, as I don't expect this is going to get much traction thanks to YouTube's algorithm. Thanks for that. But beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process, get albums onto my schedule, or hell, just argue with me directly on Discord or support the channel, link to my Patreon right over there. Don't feel obligated, tough times, I understand, but if you want to, options available. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.